So, throughout our study of European history, I focused a lot on biography. I like telling the story of individuals because for me, there's really no better way to get a feel of what a particular time and place was like than to learn about the story of a human being who had hopes and dreams like you and me and who lived in that particular time and place. So, I tell the story of a lot of people as I tell the story of European history. But the majority of people that I talk about are men, overwhelmingly men. So, where are all the women in history? Are women not contributing to history? Well, of course they are. But the simple and sad reason for why I speak or why I talk mostly about men is because throughout most of the era of history that we need to study, women have been oppressed. And they've been oppressed on many levels. They've been legally oppressed because they didn't have the same rights or powers as men. They were, for most of European history, property of fathers and husbands. There was economic oppression. Women simply didn't have the same job opportunities, and then they didn't have the opportunity to control their own money. So that will keep you oppressed if you don't have access to or the ability to control money. Education. Women were, even if they did get educated, they were not educated in the same way as men. Things like mathematics, science. Women were deprived of being educated in those fields, if they were able to be educated at all. And then there's the psychological oppression that comes along with being raised as a female in this particular culture, where you are expected to be a wife and a mother, and that's it. And you just sort of absorb those values and you don't question them because very few of us actually question the values of our society to the point that we want to break free from those values. So women, for the most part, have been oppressed, which is why the majority of our study of European history is focused on men. However, there have been a handful of powerful, influential, historically significant women that I have taught you guys about. And I've tried to think about what makes those women different. And I've come up with 3 categories of women that have been historically significant. And here are the 3 categories that I've come up with. The first is they had a dad who was powerful and who loved them. So an example of this would be from ancient history. We learned about Hypatia of Alexandria. And then in the 18th century, we learned about Émilie du Châtelet, the important French mathematician and the lover of Voltaire. And in both of these cases, these women had men who were very powerful and who loved them. So they protected their daughters and they educated them so that they could become the geniuses that they became. This is not to diminish their abilities. Obviously, but it just goes to show that, had they not had the dads and been born into the families that they were born into, their geniuses would have never had an opportunity to flourish. So having a dad that loves you and protects you and educates you, that's the first category that I was able to think of. The second category, you were born into a powerful aristocratic or royal family. So examples of this. Queen Elizabeth I of England, Tsarina Catherine II of Russia, Empress Maria Theresa of the Habsburg dynasty. All 3 of these women are examples of powerful women that were born into powerful families. Again, this is not to diminish their incredible abilities as heads of state. Obviously, Elizabeth, Catherine, Maria Theresa, they all were incredible and maintaining their power, and especially in the case of Catherine II, really acquiring power. She killed her husband. So, but these were women who were born into powerful families. The third category that I was able to think of were women who became great seductresses. So, examples of this: Josephine de Beauharnais, the first wife of Napoleon, and Madame Pompadour, the mistress of Louis XV, the King of France. These are women who use their own charms and their beauty to seduce powerful men. And then once they seduced these powerful men, they were secured a particular powerful position in society. But that power rested upon their ability to seduce. So those are the three categories that I was able to come up with in terms of influential women in history thus far in our study of European history. They had dads that loved and protected and educated them. They were born into aristocracy or royalty, and then they used that power. And then three, they were seductresses. Okay. But what if you were just an ordinary woman and you wanted to live free? Do we have any examples of a woman who's just born into an ordinary family and had a dad who didn't really show much care for them at all, and they were able to break free of these confines of oppression? Well, I'm happy to say yes. And that's why I enjoy providing one lecture that doesn't focus on any man, but rather two very historically significant and important women. Mary Wollstonecraft, who comes around at the end of the 18th century, and her daughter, who sadly she never knew, Mary Shelley, who is an important literary figure in the early 19th century. These are examples of women who defy those categories that I came up with. They simply endeavored to, one, live free, defy convention, be essentially social revolutionaries, and live free. And in living free in their own respective ways, inspire other women to live free as well. So this particular lecture is about Mary Wollstonecraft and her daughter, Mary Shelley, or as I have attempted to creatively entitle this lecture, this is Feminism and Frankenstein. I hope you enjoy it. Hey, all right there, Eurobears. This is the story of Mary Wollstonecraft, the late 18th century English feminist, and her daughter, the Gothic novelist Mary Shelley. Sadly, Mary Wollstonecraft did not get to know her daughter, Mary Shelley. This is the story of feminism and Frankenstein. Let's get to it. All right, this is Mary Wollstonecraft. She was born in the year 1759 and she died in 1797. It was a very short life. And man, she packed a whole lot into this life. But of all the things I'm going to talk about, here are the very basics that you need to know as a student of European history. She was an English novelist and philosopher. Her most important and most significant work is the 1792 work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. I will speak later about what this book is and what this book is not. Within the greater context of European history, she is usually considered to be the first English-speaking feminist. And the principal reason for this is that work, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. So this is what we need to know about Mary Wollstonecraft for AP European history. However, as important as it was that she took the principles of the Enlightenment on defying tradition and authority and embracing reason and the rights of men and applying all those things to women and vindicating the lives of women and saying that women should have the same rights as men. If that's all you learn about Mary Wollstonecraft, then you are depriving yourself of the inspiration of her story. Because, like I was getting to in the introduction, Wollstonecraft did something that I don't think any other woman before her was able to do, which was to live free and influence history on her own terms. Her life is truly a revolutionary life. I even think in several ways that if Mary Wollstonecraft lived in the 21st century, or rather by 21st century standards, her life is still rather revolutionary. And she even knew this at the time. And I think she really felt this at the time. She knew what she was doing. And this is reflected in a quote from a letter to her sister that she wrote in her late 20s. She wrote, "I am not born to tread the beaten track. The peculiar bent of my nature pushes me on. I am going to be the first. of a new genus. I tremble at the attempt. I like this particular quote because it reveals that Mary Wollstonecraft is very conscious as a young woman about how she is trying to be a very different type of woman, a free, liberated woman who is going to defy social convention in how she lives her life. So she's conscious of that, but she's also scared of that. That last phrase, I tremble at the attempt. I think there have been many people throughout history who have attempted to live their lives in complete defiance of convention because they don't agree with, or they may even downright despise, the culture of their community, country, whatever. And they're going to live very different types of lives. And they know that this is not going to make life easy for them. They're going to be ridiculed. It's probably going to be very hard for them to hold down a job, or to have a family, or to have friends. It's a very scary prospect to be the first of a new type of person. And that's what makes the story, for me, of Mary Wollstonecraft so incredible. Okay, Mary Wollstonecraft did work her way up from being an unknown individual to being probably the most famous female author of the late 18th century. And the reason why she became so famous was because of, well, the content of her books, but she had to find a publisher to publish her books, and then also by the completely free and rather radical lifestyle in which she lived. And much of this lecture will be dedicated to those books and her lifestyle. To give you a sense of how much of a celebrity she was, on this side of the Atlantic, in the early, young United States of America, the President of the United States, John Adams, and his wife, Abigail Adams, were both admirers of Mary Wollstonecraft, although they admired Mary Wollstonecraft in different ways. Abigail Adams really admired Mary Wollstonecraft for her feminist theory, and John Adams used to ridicule his wife Abigail. If he thought Abigail was getting too uppity, he would refer to her as, quote, a Wollstonecraft. But then later on, John Adams read Mary Wollstonecraft's work on the French Revolution. It was a nonfiction work on the French Revolution, and he said it was the most insightful work on what was then a current event that he had ever read. So pretty amazing that this woman who just wanted to live free in England ended up influencing the President and First Lady of the United States. All right, so who was Mary Wollstonecraft? So Mary Wollstonecraft was born in 1759 England. She had several brothers and sisters. She was one of the older siblings, and she did not have much of a happy childhood, mostly because her father was an alcoholic and a bit of a bastard. And that might be a harsh word, but I'm sticking with it. Mary Wollstonecraft's paternal grandfather had made quite a bit of money, but her dad, he really wasn't able to hold on to that money. He engaged in several failing business ventures, but then as those businesses failed and the family started to lose money, Dad could not emotionally handle it because he still wanted to live the lifestyle of somebody who had money. He became very depressed and he turned to the bottle and he became an alcoholic, and he was a mean drunk. Mom was at home raising Mary and the other children, and he would come home drunk and frequently beat his wife, Mary's mom. And we start to get a strong sense of Mary Wollstonecraft's personality when she was a teenage girl. When it grew late and Dad wasn't home, she assumed, usually correctly, that Dad was out drinking. And Mary, instead of going to bed, would lay down and sleep by the front door of her home, so that when Dad came in drunk, he would literally stumble over her. And that way, Mary would be able to stand up and defend her mother from her dad's alcoholic wrath. And this early teenage experience of Mary Wollstonecraft was influential. She will spend quite a bit of her life trying to protect and take care of her family. Later on, she will rescue her younger sister from an abusive relationship. When Mary Wollstonecraft becomes famous and starts making money from her books, she'll end up having to financially support a lot of her brothers and sisters. Or I think she had one brother and several sisters. Can't remember specifically. Sorry about that. But she'd financially take care of her siblings. And then this is her model of a husband. Her alcoholic dad who beats her mom. Needless to say, Mary Wollstonecraft grew up with not a very positive image of married life. And fairly early on in her childhood, she dedicates herself to being single for the remainder of her life. She never wants to be in a position that her mom was in. She never wants to be dependent on a man who has terrible business instincts. She never wants to be stuck with a man who's physically and emotionally abusive. She wants to be free and in control of her own life. But the thing is, well, how do you do that? How do you live free? Well, Mary Wollstonecraft saw her way out in education. She herself received a basic education. She learned how to read and write, obviously, and she pursued philosophical books, books that ordinarily girls wouldn't read. She took an interest to such works of political philosophy, social philosophy. She was particularly interested in Rousseau. And one thing Mary Wollstonecraft figured out at a fairly young age, and really she dedicates her whole life to this idea, is that a way for a female to empower herself is to educate herself. Learn, learn, learn. And don't learn the stuff that you're expected to learn as a girl. Learn everything. So Mary Wollstonecraft became a voracious reader and a highly intelligent young lady. And in her early 20s, she got a job being a governess in Ireland. Now, a governess is essentially a live-in tutor. So she's in Ireland. In particular, she's in Northern Ireland. So with a British aristocratic family. And they hired her to live with them in this very nice large house and to educate their children. Now, this was a fairly intense job. So Mary Wollstonecraft was a teacher. I'm a teacher. I think a lot about how different these particular teaching positions are. Whereas I teach over 100 students on any particular year, Mary Wollstonecraft was living with a family, which meant she had to be up at 5 a.m., make the breakfast for the kids, teach all of them various subjects throughout the day, feed them throughout the day, and she really was with them, putting them to bed at night. And her journals from this period of time reveal how little she slept, and I guess a typical 20-something, she can get away with not sleeping much, because she'd put the kids down a little bit before midnight, and then she would stay up till like 1, 2 in the morning doing her own reading and writing, which means she was probably only sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night. At least that's what her journals reveal, is that she was sleeping very little. And then how she was teaching the kids and what she was teaching these children, in particular the girls of this family, was very non-traditional. So hopefully you remember from the lecture on Voltaire and on Émilie du Châtelet what a blue stocking was. And a blue stocking was a well-educated female of the 18th century, but she was only educated or well-educated in a particular way. Girls were expected to learn languages, and they were expected to read works of fiction that were very sentimental. So in other words, it was thought that females should cultivate their sensitivity. So they would read these novels with these, Prince Charming-like figures who were heroic and who would protect their ladies. And the women, or the female figures in this literature, they were passionate, they were emotional, and they were loving and supportive to these, Prince Charming characters. And Mary Wollstonecraft, she hated that type of literature. She was grossed out by it, and she thought that it's manipulative for girls to be learning this stuff, and that girls should be taught the same curriculum as boys: mathematics, science, philosophy, history, because that stuff is real. It improves your mind, it makes you a better person, and it inspires you to live a better life. So in this particular way, Mary Wollstonecraft is a very modern figure. I mean, imagine if you took a girl in the 21st century and you only showed her, let's say, television shows and movies that never featured strong, independent, educated women. But all the women they ever saw were just, ditzy, sentimental, and sexy. Think about what type of impact that would have on that girl as she grew up in terms of what she thought she should be like as a woman. And so this is one of the central ideas of Mary Wollstonecraft throughout her entire life. Females need to be educated differently. They need to be educated like men are educated, or like boys are educated. And if you do that, you will unleash the power of females. So she starts teaching the girls of this family in Ireland, the King family. And this is not what the mom and dad that hired her were expecting. They weren't expecting their daughters to be learning mathematics and science and philosophy and history and all this. And what's interesting is the girls, there were 2 girls that she was educating in this family, and one of them didn't like Mary Wollstonecraft. She didn't like learning this stuff. She wanted to stick with the romantic novels. but the other one, the older girl, did, and her name was Margaret King. And Margaret King is not a very well-known person in history, but her story is amazing because she was directly inspired by Mary Wollstonecraft to live this free and independent life. So Mary Wollstonecraft will eventually lose her job with this family and she'll go back to England. But Margaret King grew up inspired by her old teacher. And so Margaret King, when she becomes a young woman, will run away to the German states for a period of time where she dressed up like a man. So every day she would dress in drag so that she could go to medical school someplace in the German states. I don't remember where. She eventually came back to the British Isles where she was, arguably, to our knowledge, the first female medical doctor in British history. Mary Wollstonecraft was a direct inspiration of that. And also, Mary Wollstonecraft will die very young, sadly, and Margaret King will step in to provide help and assistance for Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter, Mary Shelley, at a particular point of time in her life. That was Margaret King's way of giving back to her old teacher, Mary Wollstonecraft. All right, so all this is going on in the early 1780s, but she lost her job, heads back to England, and she ends up going to a suburb of London, or what's today a suburb of London, called Newington Green. And she goes to Newington Green because it's a place where she feels like she can be at home. There was a community of radicals that lived in this kind of village outside of London. And among the radicals that were there at particular points of time that she got to know in the late 1780s was Thomas Paine, the radical political philosopher who wrote Common Sense, which helped inspire the American Revolution. And then he came to the American colonies as they were breaking off free and helped to inspire the American Continental Army as they were fighting the British in December of 1776, when this army under George Washington was stationed in New Jersey, and they were freezing. It was December, and their commissions were up on January the 1st, and most of them were planning on just going home. And if that happened, then the British will likely win the American Revolution. And Thomas Paine inspired them to fight with a pamphlet that he called The American Crisis. And it was so moving and so passionate. This great testimony on why you should be willing to fight for freedom that inspired the American troops to stay on. It also inspired them to follow George Washington to cross the Delaware River to attack the British forces at Trenton and win on Christmas Day of 1776. And now I'm well into a digression here that I didn't mean to go on. But Thomas Paine, he was pretty much an anarchist in terms of his radical political philosophy, and Mary Wollstonecraft was hanging out with him at Newington Green. The other individual that she spent time with at Newington Green was a poet by the name of William Blake. Now, I didn't mention William Blake when I was talking about the other Romantic poets, like Coleridge and Wordsworth, but William Blake was another very important Romantic poet, and just like Coleridge and Wordsworth and Byron, Blake's life is a pretty amazing life. So, you had guys like Coleridge who were using laudanum to get their inspirations. William Blake was interesting in that he would not do drugs, but just have these amazing visions. And then he would pass out and go into convulsions. And when he awoke from these seizures, he tried to write about the visions that he said that he had. And these visions were these sweeping, mystical experiences in which Blake felt that he was being given this universal understanding on the nature of the universe and life. And so William Blake's poetry is very mystical, very intense. Now today, we try to look at William Blake through a 21st century lens, and we wonder what was going on with William Blake. He would be granted these visions, and then right when he's getting these visions, he'd pass out and he'd start having seizures. Some people today believe that he may have had something called epileptic seizures of the temporal lobe, or in other words, he had epilepsy, but his epilepsy was concentrated in the temporal lobe of his brain, because people who have this condition tend to experience types of things that William Blake experienced, but nobody's been able to write about those things like William Blake was able to write about them. So that's William Blake, great late 18th century Romantic poet, and another one of these sort of radical, non-traditional, brilliant writers that Mary Wollstonecraft was hanging out with at Newington Green. Now, how was Mary Wollstonecraft surviving at this particular time in her life? Well, at this time, Mary Wollstonecraft had with her her younger sister, Bess. And Mary had just recently rescued her younger sister, Bess, out of a horrible situation. Bess had fallen in love and got married to this guy, and Mary had warned her, do not get married to this guy. Mary Wollstonecraft didn't think that the guy that her younger sister was getting married to was a good guy at all, and Mary's intuition was correct. Bess got pregnant, gave birth to a little boy, and after that, Bess started experiencing what we would today call postpartum depression, a debilitating depression, and she found herself unable to take care of her own son, and also she wasn't able to satisfy her husband romantically. And so this guy was really frustrated. My wife isn't taking care of my son, and that's what she's supposed to do. She's the mom, and she's also not taking care of me in the bedroom. And so Bess started experiencing what we'd call today marital rape. But the concept of marital rape was unknown in the 18th century. In the 18th century, you're a wife, you're a woman, this is your duty. Take care of your husband. But Bess got raped by her husband, and then she plummets even further into depression, and she can't take care of her husband, her son, or herself. And it would have been within her husband's rights to simply have his wife locked up into a mental institution. So it's into this situation that Mary Wollstonecraft shows up, literally kidnaps her sister, and the two of them eventually end up in Newington Green. Now, this act, just to give you a sense of what life was like for a woman in the 18th century, Bess has now broken the law. She is the legal property of her husband. She is to be with her husband, even though he is physically and emotionally abusive. Lucky for Bess, this man was at least decent enough to divorce her so that she could go free. And sadly, their son, that she was never able to see again, ended up dying as a very young child. I'm not sure exactly how long he lasted after she left. And after this experience, Mary Wollstonecraft told her daughter, or her younger sister, Bess, okay, now be independent, be free, educate yourself. But sadly, Bess is really just going to be a drain on Mary throughout most of her life, expecting Mary to take care of her. And this just reinforces in Mary Wollstonecraft that this is the problem. Women are expecting men to take care of them or other people to take care of them. So Mary and her younger sister, Bess, did for a while try to start up a school. So instead of being governesses or individual live-in tutors with a family, they tried to have a school for girls, to educate girls in this new radical way. They did start this school. They did get, they did have some pupils. There were some girls that attended the school, but it didn't really work out financially. And Mary needed another way to make money. So she wrote about what she knew: education, and specifically the education of young females. Mary Wollstonecraft's first work was Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. And the thesis of this work is probably what you should expect at this point in time in the lecture. Females need to be educated like males. Math, science, philosophy, history, not just romantic novels and French and Latin and language arts, but the subjects that will empower any individual, male or female. And if you do that, then you will unleash the potential of half the population. Now, the argument against Mary Wollstonecraft at this time was women aren't intelligent enough to learn math, science, philosophy, history, all this stuff. Mary Wollstonecraft's rebuttal is very simple. Well, girls aren't intelligent enough to learn that stuff because they never have been taught that stuff. But the potential is there. Hey, in this way, Mary Wollstonecraft is very much a student and disciple of John Locke. She too believed that human beings were born blank slates, females and males alike, and that the only reason why females grow up to be these dainty, stupid things is because that is what they are taught to be. And if you teach them differently, they will unleash their potential, and they'll live happier lives. They will be more moral and productive human beings. All right, so there was one more radical at Newington Green that Mary Wollstonecraft took a keen interest in, and his name was Henry Fuselli. Henry Fuselli was a Swiss artist who painted some pretty radical things. Both of these paintings are Henry Fuselli's. I'll show you his most famous painting here in just a moment. But there's Henry Fuselli, who's painted himself there on the left, and he's in a conversation with another individual. And there's, gosh, I don't know, this big Greek sculpture or ghost or something standing behind them. And then off to the right there, you see Henry Fuselli's portrait of his wife, Sophia. So Mary Wollstonecraft really enjoyed the company of Henry Fuselli. How much she enjoyed the company of Henry Fuselli is open to debate. He was a married man, and Mary Wollstonecraft was in all likelihood not interested in a romantic relationship, but she really did click with this guy, and they would spend long hours talking, exchanging ideas. They clearly enjoyed each other's company. They were sort of like soulmates. And I think it's fairly safe to say that Mary Wollstonecraft loved Henry Fuselli, and Henry may have loved Mary Wollstonecraft too, but it would have been more of a platonic intellectual love. But they grew so close that Mary Wollstonecraft made a proposal to Henry and Sophia Fuselli, which was, "Let me live with you." She herself never wanted to get married. She did not believe in marriage. Mary Wollstonecraft would later advocate that marriage was itself an immoral institution that brought out the worst in people. But she really liked this couple and she wanted to live with them. So she made this proposal to Henry and Sophia Fuselli. Henry agreed that this would be an absolutely all right arrangement. Sophia did not. And in fact, Sophia said, "Not only will you not live with us, Mary Wollstonecraft, but you are never to see my husband again." And that was the end of this relationship. So here is Henry Fuselli's most famous painting. It is called The Incubus, and it is a bizarre, nightmarish image that you can look at and have fun interpreting. The Incubus. All right, I'll give you a second here. All right, and then comes the event that not only changes the course of French history and European history as a whole, possibly world history, but this is the event that also changes the life of Mary Wollstonecraft. And the French Revolution of 1789 impacts Mary Wollstonecraft in this indirect way, but it does eventually lead her to become this household name by the early 1790s in England. So how does that happen? How did the French Revolution catapult Mary Wollstonecraft at Newington Green in England into being a celebrity? Well, so there are several parts to this story, but it happens like this. In the year 1789, the French Revolution happens. After the Women's Bread March on Versailles, we've got a captured king and the royal family. We now have a constitutional monarchy. We have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens. Let me say it right. The Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And now all of Europe is looking at France. Is this going to work? Because if this works, this spells doom for the traditional feudal structure of society everywhere in Europe. And even though England, or the United Kingdom rather, was a constitutional monarchy, it's still, the French Revolution still threatens to topple the very hierarchical culture of the United Kingdom. So, needless to say, everybody in Europe is talking about the French Revolution. And up in England, there was probably no more significant and influential piece of literature written on the French Revolution than Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which he published in 1790. All right, Edmund Burke. I briefly talked about Edmund Burke in the lecture on Romanticism, specifically his concept of the sublime. But now let me talk about Edmund Burke in a completely different light. So Edmund Burke was from Dublin, Ireland, so he's Irish, but he became a member of Parliament. He is today remembered as the father of conservatism. He's also identified as an enlightened conservative and a chief figure of the Enlightenment. But here's what makes him the father of conservatism. In his writings, he explains how convention and tradition are the glue that hold a society together. So, etiquette, morals, traditions, these are very important things that should always remain, and if they change, they should only change very, very slowly. Okay, so this is what makes Edmund Burke today considered to be the father of conservatism. He believes that you should conserve traditions in the family, traditions in society. You should hold on to traditional manners and etiquette because these are the things that keep society glued together. And if you get rid of these things, you have anarchy, and to some degree or another, society falls apart and people become miserable. So, okay, Edmund Burke, mind your manners, respect your culture's traditions. These are important things that keep society glued together. All right, so Edmund Burke was a member of Parliament during the time of the American War for Independence, so our revolution. He was a member of Parliament when the American colonists said, we want to break off and go free, and here's our Declaration of Independence. And Edmund Burke was one of the few members of Parliament who supported the American revolutionaries. Now that's interesting. Here is the father of conservatism supporting a Republican revolution in the American colonies. What was his thinking there? Well, his thinking there was this. Prior to the 1760s, the Americans never had to pay a tax to the crown. There was no stamp tax. There were no fixed prices on tea, other things that the British were doing at the time. So Burke argues that the American colonists had operated economically independent of the United Kingdom. And so now in the 1760s, when the British start placing taxes on the Americans, it's the Americans' right to revolt because they don't want something new. So in other words, in the eyes of Edmund Burke, the American Revolution started for conservative reasons. The American colonists were trying to maintain their old culture of not paying taxes to the crown. So here's Burke, by the way. I mean, go figure. American conservatives today love the fact that the father of conservative was supportive of the American Revolution back in the 1760s, 1770s. So, but here's Edmund Burke, who supported, or at least understood, the reasons behind the American colonists and thought that Parliament and the king were in the wrong during the time of the American War for Independence, or what we call the American Revolution today. Okay, so now comes the French Revolution of 1789. So we're a decade and a half later. The French are having their Republican Revolution. What does Burke think about the French Revolution? Burke wrote this essay, Reflections on the Revolution in France. And in it, he makes the prediction that France will, within the following years, descend into anarchy. He makes this prediction. He said by overthrowing the king, by abolishing aristocracy, by providing all individuals with rights, the French are completely breaking away from tradition. What was once standard in French society is now obliterated. Burke predicts that the French will start turning away from God and the Christian church, and that eventually the French will start killing themselves. Or in other words, they'll start killing each other. That's what Burke predicted in 1790. And of course, Burke ended up being dead right. Now, the causes for the breakdown in France, you can argue whether or not Burke was right there, but in terms of what happened, he predicted it. He called it, which is why a lot of people today look back upon Edmund Burke as an incredibly brilliant human being. So here's Edmund Burke. He supported the American Revolution. He did not support the French Revolution. And his reasoning for both of these was the importance of preserving traditional culture and manners and morality. The Americans were fighting to preserve their traditions, and the French were trying to overturn their traditions, and that's why the American Revolution was successful and the French Revolution fails. All right, so that's Edmund Burke. What's this have to do with Mary Wollstonecraft? Well, Mary Wollstonecraft, like pretty much every other person who could read in England at the time, read Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, and Mary Wollstonecraft hated it. She hated this thing. Mary Wollstonecraft was a big believer in the revolutions in France, and so she decides to write her rebuttal to Edmund Burke, and she got it published by her friend who was a publisher at Newington Green. And here's what Mary Wollstonecraft wrote, and let me read the full title. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote, "A Vindication of the Rights of Men," in a letter to the Right Honorable Edmund Burke, occasioned by his reflections on the Revolution in France, by Mary Wollstonecraft. All right, and the thesis of Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Men was this: tradition is subordinate to justice. Tradition is subordinate to justice. It is incorrect for Edmund Burke or anybody to argue that there should not be a revolution in France because it overturns tradition when individuals are starving,
when there are corrupt institutions that govern the lives of the majority of people in France, when the traditions of society uphold and protect unjust institutions, then society demands a revolution for the benefit of all people. So Mary Wollstonecraft published this at Newington Green with the help of the publisher Joseph Johnson, and this rebuttal to Burke became extraordinarily popular. Now, the first publications of this that went out did not actually have Mary Wollstonecraft's name on it. It was simply M.W. So people didn't know that this was coming from a woman. And there was a little bit of sensation behind, well, who is this M.W. who spoke up against Burke and who offered a pretty solid argument against Burke's argument that justice is more important than tradition. Now, it was very much the culture of, in particular, London at the time, to have these coffee house debates. And these were mostly men that would gather in these coffee houses and they would talk about these pamphlets. So let's remember this is a time before, telecommunications like we have today. It was an exciting thing to go to these coffee houses, pick up a few of these pamphlets, maybe some of which you'd bought and you're sharing and you're passing these things around and you're reading them and you're arguing about the points. It was a very important part of the intellectual culture in the British Isles at the time, and in particular England, was these coffee house debates. Very similar to the salons in France in the 18th century. And so people would talk about Burke's reflections on the Revolution of France and this vindication of the rights of men by this M.W. And then it comes out that M.W. is a woman. And people were already enamored with the arguments and debates of vindication of the rights of men. And now it's exposed, wow, this argument came from a female, and Mary Wollstonecraft becomes, almost overnight, a household name in London and throughout much of England. So she's done it. She's now one of these celebrities at Newington Green. She's achieved fame and at least some financial security from the merits of her own labor, her own hard work, and her own intellectual brilliance. So that's it. That's how the French Revolution indirectly made Mary Wollstonecraft a celebrity. But we do not remember Mary Wollstonecraft today as being primarily the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Men, but from another work with a very similar title. And here's how that next book came about. Her publisher, Joseph Johnson, himself a radical at Newington Green, who enjoyed publishing all these radical works to shake up traditional English society. He approached Mary Wollstonecraft and said, "You've done very well with your vindication of the rights of men, but the thesis that you presented in this book is not the idea that you are most passionate about." And Joseph Johnson encouraged her, Mary Wollstonecraft, to write a lengthy philosophical work advocating for the rights of women. Joseph Johnson knew that was the big idea that Mary Wollstonecraft wanted to convey to the public, that was the revolution that she wanted to start, to free women from the traditional constraints of society. And it was at this moment in the early 1790s, right after she had achieved fame with A Vindication of the Rights of Men, that Joseph Johnson said, "Now is your time. People know who you are. They want to read your next work. So strike while the iron is hot. Write your book." So Mary Wollstonecraft did write her book. Published in the year 1792, this was her epic masterpiece, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It was not a work that Mary Wollstonecraft found easy to write. And in fact, in terms of all of her works, this probably isn't the best written work. It's a little bit clunky to read because it was written in sections. And there were times when Mary Wollstonecraft herself wanted to destroy it. I think, and I'm no Wollstonecraft scholar, but I think what Mary Wollstonecraft was going through was the fact that she was writing about something that she was so passionate about. And I think that's hard to do. If you're trying to write a paper about something that you know a lot about, but you don't feel like this is your life's work, your life's passion, it's probably easier to get that written and done and published. But I think it's because this was such an important message that Mary Wollstonecraft wanted to convey, and it was really she's writing about the values upon which she has based her entire life. It was hard for her to write. And there were several times where her publisher, Joseph Johnson, had to really kind of keep encouraging her to keep going with it. She was submitting to him a chapter at a time, and he actually toyed with her a little bit when she would come to him and say, "Oh, I want to give up. I want to give up." And he'd say, "Okay, if you want to give up, that's fine. I'll just take the chapters that you've written already and I'll burn them so that, you won't have to worry about them anymore." And then the thought of having her work destroyed would be like, "Oh, no, it's okay. Okay, I'll keep writing." And so he would sort of mess with her a little bit like that to keep her going. I think there are a lot of stories throughout literary history of the relationship that writers have with their publishers and their editors, and how the editors and publishers really do a lot to make books come into existence. So anyway, Mary Wollstonecraft publishes this book in 1792, and it is considered today the most important work that she ever wrote, the most influential, and it is really considered to be a foundational text in feminism. And Mary Wollstonecraft is really considered to be the first feminist of the English-speaking world. There were other women who had advocated for the rights of women elsewhere, like Olympe de Gouges, not but a few years before in France. But there's not really anything like this prior to Mary Wollstonecraft in the history of the English-speaking people. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about what this book is and what this book is not. And then I will provide you with some examples, some excerpts from this book. Okay, so this book is considered to be a work of the Enlightenment. Essentially, the easiest way to understand this book is that Mary Wollstonecraft is going to take the central arguments of the Enlightenment and apply them to the home and to women. So, if the central idea of the Enlightenment is that we are to reject tradition and authority and create a new society that's based upon reason, then why can we not also reject the tradition and the authority of having a man in the position of power in the household and the woman a subject to the man, and instead create a new society based on reason where both women and men are free? So, another way of phrasing this. Women at the time were considered to be more delicate creatures than men. They were physically weaker, and they were mentally less intelligent than men. Women were more emotional, men were more rational. Therefore, women were to be the property of men. Women were to be the servants of men. Women had no political or economic rights, and that was okay because it seemed to reflect a natural order. That was the standard at the time. Mary Wollstonecraft comes along and says, in her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, that tradition needs to be challenged based upon reason. And just like we've challenged the divine right of kings, now we need to challenge the divine right of husbands over wives and men over women. So that's the central idea of this book, and I hope that helps you to make sense of it within the context of the 18th century and the era of the Enlightenment. Now, when you actually get into the content of this book, it's far more than just a work of the Enlightenment. It's very sociological and psychological in character. Mary Wollstonecraft talks a lot about the stuff that she has written about before, which is how females need to be educated so that they can respect themselves and live an independent life. That when they're only educated to be blue stockings, when they're only given the sentimental literature, that makes them psychologically frail creatures. It makes them more immoral, as well as unable to fulfill their full potential as human beings. There's a lot of psychological stuff in this particular book, and she talks about how society and the expectations of girls on society damages girls psychologically as they're growing up. And so you have all of these stupid, frail, emotionally insecure women, and if women could have a proper upbringing with good education, with opportunities to be independent, then you'd have better women and a better society, and there'd be healthier relationships between men and women. So this book is very emotional and psychological and sociological. The one thing this book is not is a work of political science. And I think that's what most people who don't read this book and who only understand this book sort of in general don't understand. They see the title of the book and they say, well, Mary Wollstonecraft was arguing for women to have the right to vote. There is no, this is not a book of advocating for women's suffrage. That doesn't come along for about a half a century after this work. Mary Wollstonecraft is not crying for women to have the right to vote. Not that she would have been averse to that, it's just not what she was dealing with in this book. This book is about the empowerment of the female mind. The other thing about this book, in terms of what it is, it's very much a treatise against marriage. There's quite a bit of text in this book dedicated to explaining how the institution of marriage is morally detrimental to both the man and the woman. On the part of the man, absolute power corrupts absolutely. On the part of the female, she becomes a servant and deprived of her own independent agency. So insofar as this book is an instruction manual for women to live an independent life, marriage is something definitely to be avoided. There's also quite a bit in this book about how to be a parent, how to raise girls, and then of course how to educate girls. And so that's a vindication of the rights of women. Okay, because it's considered to be her epic masterpiece, I do have a few excerpts from it. This first is from the introduction when she's writing to women. And this is a great excerpt because it really reveals how this is a work of the Enlightenment, talking about how she's going to deal with women as rational creatures, but then it also talks about how she's trying to shake women out of, just being these dainty, cute, unintelligent things that men have encouraged them to believe over the course of their lives. So here she goes. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote, "My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures, instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. I wish to persuade women to acquire strength, both of mind and body, and to convince them that the soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement and taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness." All right, so that's from the introduction, setting up the whole book. Another great excerpt that really reflects how Wollstonecraft is simply applying the ideals of the Enlightenment, which so many people agree with, especially in England. And she's simply applying these values to women. And so she wrote, "The divine right of husbands, like the divine right of kings, may, it is hoped, in this enlightened age, be contested without danger." So it's a great example of how this is a work of the Enlightenment. But then also, I found this excerpt. This one is great because it shows how psychological this book is, and also how poetic Mary Wollstonecraft could be in describing the lives of women and what psychologically they go through. And this is also a particular excerpt from The Vindication, which was written in 1792, that many people believe can still be applied to the lives of women today in the 21st century. So let's check out this excerpt. "Taught from infancy that beauty is woman's scepter, the mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming round its gilt cage only seeks to adorn its prison." All right, wow. Let's look into this one again. Let's hear it again. "Taught from infancy that beauty is woman's scepter, the mind shapes itself to the body, and, roaming round its gilt cage, only seeks to adorn its prison." All right, wow. Okay, so what's Wollstonecraft saying there? Well, taught from infancy that beauty is woman's scepter. What that means is, while growing up from the very beginning, a girl is taught that your only power is your beauty. So what's the psychological impact of that? Well, the psychological impact of that is the mind shapes itself to the body. So in other words, you are your body, and there is nothing else. You are what you look like. You are this sexual object. And so, roaming around its gilt cage, you only seek to adorn your prison. In other words, you're imprisoned in your body. You can't get beyond this. You can't develop your mind to have this greater sense of self, something beyond just your physical body. And so you're trapped in your body. You're trapped with your body. And you spend the rest of your life adorning your prison, prettying up this body of yours in which you are trapped, believing that that is your only means to power. And of course, the rest of this book is, no, you can empower yourself by educating yourself and freeing yourself. All right. So there are several quotes from Mary Wollstonecraft's epic, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Let's continue on with her life story. So, Mary Wollstonecraft endeavored to be a very moral, just person. She didn't just want to talk a talk, she wanted to walk the walk as well. So she had written this essay in support of the French Revolution. So in 1793, Mary Wollstonecraft went to France to be part of the French Revolution. 1793. You know what's going on in 1793? The Terror is what's going on in 1793. And that's what Mary Wollstonecraft walked into. Now, it was also an extraordinarily dangerous thing for a woman from England to go to France, because even though she went to France at a time when there was peace between France and England, those peace treaties that happened between France and England were always very unstable, to say the least. France and England were constantly going to war throughout the period of time of the French Revolution, and especially during the Napoleonic Age. I mean, every other English man and English woman were doing their darndest to get out of France, especially when the Terror started. And here comes Mary Wollstonecraft, a single, solitary woman from England, and she goes to France. Now, while she's in France, she's got a little bit of money to survive because of the publication of her past two works. They had sold well enough that she now has the money to travel and to live in France for a little while. And while she's there, she is going to write on the French Revolution. This is the book that she wrote, which is a pretty long book. I've actually never seen it. It's in its entirety. The modern versions of this book are all expurgated versions. They're all sort of edited down because it was so long. But she wrote this detailed account of what was going on in France in the 1790s. This was the book that John Adams read and really enjoyed. He felt that this book provided a really good insight in terms of what happened during the French Revolution. And remember, Mary Wollstonecraft showed up in 1793, so she wasn't there for Tennis Court Oath or the storming of the Bastille, Women's Bread March to Versailles, any of that stuff. But she did talk to people who were participants in those events, and so she was operating pretty much as a journalist at this point in time in history. And so she did eventually publish this work right here, An Historical and Moral View of the Origin and Progress of the French Revolution and the Effect It Has Produced in Europe. Now, while Mary Wollstonecraft was in France, a couple of things. One, I always enjoy knowing that she really struggled with the French language. So she had learned a little bit of French growing up in school, but she never got fluent. And while she was living over there for several years, she never got completely fluent and comfortable with the language. I think it's great that one of the greatest writers in the English language, Mary Wollstonecraft, who published multiple books, as much as she loves language and as much command as she had over the English language, she never really got comfortable with French. Her French was always very clumsy. I just like knowing that really smart people struggled with learning foreign languages too, even while she was completely submerged in the culture. And the other thing about Mary Wollstonecraft while she was in France was it's amazing she didn't get killed. It's just amazing. She was an English woman there solo. I mean, this was during the time of the Terror. All it would have taken would have been a couple of sans-culottes to identify her as English, brought her before a tribunal. Even the suggestion that she was a spy would have gotten her head chopped off. But that never happened. And one of the reasons why it never happened was because, well, Mary Wollstonecraft fell in love when she was in France, and this man did a lot to protect her. Now what's interesting is who Mary Wollstonecraft fell in love with and why she fell in love with him. While she was living in Paris, France, Mary Wollstonecraft fell in love with an American. His name was Gilbert Imlay. Born and raised in New Jersey, he grew up and joined the American Continental Army during the American Revolution. And it's kind of interesting. We have Gilbert Imlay on the historical record as being in the United States Continental Army for a while, and then he disappears off the record for like a couple of years. And then he comes back on the record, and when he comes back, he is of a significantly higher rank, which leads some historians to believe, as they question, well, what was Gilbert Imlay doing for a couple of years, that he was probably a spy. There was somebody matching his description who was down in Florida, during the time of his absence from the Continental Army. Florida, if you remember, was a Spanish possession at this time. Gilbert Imlay may have been spying on the Spanish for the United States government. So this is what some historians suspect, and it's probably consistent with his personality. Gilbert Imlay was a little bit of a sketchy, slimy figure. After the American Revolution, he joined Daniel Boone in the settling of Kentucky. And while he was doing that, he began embezzling money. What Gilbert Imlay did was take money from wealthy Eastern investors. Now that the American Revolution had made the United States its own free and independent country, the Americans could now ignore the proclamation line of 1763, in which the British government had made a deal with the Native American tribes saying that the white people would stay east of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, in the 1780s, the Americans wanted to spread westward, and so they went into areas like, Ohio, for example, and Kentucky to begin settling these areas that Native Americans had once thought was just going to be all theirs for forevermore, because that's what the British government had promised them after the French and Indian War. So there were all these wealthy people who were investing in lands west of the Appalachian Mountain. So Gilbert Imlay and the troop with Daniel Boone going into Kentucky to settle Kentucky, Gilbert Imlay took the money from these wealthy investors, with the promise that he was going to stake out land claims for them in Kentucky, but then he just simply disappears. He just takes the money for himself. And so when 1789 happens and the French Revolution breaks out, he simply goes to France, proclaiming that he was going to France because he believed in the freedom of all people. He had fought in the American Revolution for the rights of man here, and now he's going to go to France to fight for the freedom and independence of the French people too. So he seems like this soldier who just fights passionately for democracies, but really he's going to France so he doesn't have to give his money back, and he's a robber, he's a thief, and also he's looking for business opportunities in France. I mean, if the French are going to kill off the aristocratic class, they're going to turn loose the merchants there in France. They're going to establish their own laissez-faire economic system. Once the French Revolution settles down, France might be a great place to start a business. And Gilbert Imlay is all about making money. Money, 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 money. But here he is in Paris, France, and he meets Mary Wollstonecraft, and Mary Wollstonecraft sees him, and she fell in love with him. She fell hard in love with him. Now, what's kind of cool here is for us to learn about as Americans, the reputation that Americans had in Europe at the time. We were seen as these primitive figures on the frontier, on the very edge of civilization. So we were these sort of like noble savages in the Rousseauian sense, unrefined by traditional European culture. We were wild, we were free, we were Americans. And here comes Gilbert Imlay, straight out of the woods of Kentucky. You mean, talk about somebody who's lived free. This guy has blazed a trail and, had to kill black bears and such. And Mary Wollstonecraft just sees him as the embodiment of what a man should be. He's rugged, he's free, and he's not from a traditional conservative society. And that's really what she sees in him. And the two of them begin talking, and he is like nobody she's ever met before. Even at Newington Green, the guys that she met, like Henry Fuselli, they were very intellectual types. Gilbert Imlay is not an intellectual. He is a rugged outdoorsman. And for her, there's something incredibly enticing about that, both intellectually and probably sexually too. And he talks about the free life that he wants to live on the frontier of Kentucky. And he fills her head with these dreams he has for his life. He wants a farm of several hundred acres in the woods and the cleared land of Kentucky. And so I think about this. I think about Mary Wollstonecraft, this very well-educated English woman, dreaming about living her life with this man in Kentucky. And just, oh, Kentucky. It sounds like an exotic, dreamy place. Kentucky, Kentucky, Kentucky. But that's really what she was thinking. And she fell in love with Gilbert Imlay. Now, sadly, what she doesn't see in Gilbert Imlay is a complete shyster. This man is a con artist. So she talks to him about what she wants for her life. I want to be free. I do not believe in marriage. I believe in the independence of a woman and a man. And Gilbert Imlay, I'm quite certain, was like, well, I don't believe in marriage either, honey. And her mistake was not seeing Gilbert Imlay for who he was, a man who was going to take advantage of her. She saw in him a free spirit, which is what she was aching to be too. And she was really hoping that the two of them were going to be free spirits together. And sadly, it just didn't go down like that. Now, for the first time on record, Mary Wollstonecraft is physically intimate with another man. She most likely wasn't prior to this, and she is at this point in time in her life in her early 30s. Gilbert was the first man she gave herself to, and she got pregnant. She gave birth to a baby girl. She named her baby girl Fanny after Mary Wollstonecraft's childhood friend, who I have not mentioned in this lecture. Mary Wollstonecraft had a best friend in childhood whose name was Fanny, who sadly died at a young age a little bit before this. And so she honored her friend by naming her daughter Fanny. And after getting pregnant with Fanny, and then after giving birth to Fanny while Fanny was still a young girl, like an infant and toddler, Gilbert was clearly losing interest in Mary Wollstonecraft, spending more time away from her. Mary Wollstonecraft began writing Gilbert Imlay incessantly, and these letters are these sad, desperate letters of please come back. He was going away doing these business ventures, and Mary Wollstonecraft was disgusted by that he was so interested in like worldly financial pursuits instead of living this free and moral life like he said he wanted to live. And so Mary Wollstonecraft in her letters increasingly chastises Gilbert Imlay for being superficial, for abandoning the values that he said that he had. These letters are not the type of letters that a man is probably going to respond to positively. And what I assume happened is the more chastising Mary Wollstonecraft became in her letters, the more Gilbert Imlay just drifted further and further away. Now, the one thing Gilbert Imlay did for Mary Wollstonecraft was save her life. Mary Wollstonecraft was an Englishwoman, and she may have been executed under suspicion for being a spy. But Gilbert Imlay, because he was an American, and because the French Revolutionary government and the American government were on such good terms that he could protect her. You could be an American in Revolutionary France and be okay, but you could not be English. They will kill the English in Revolutionary France. So what Gilbert Imlay did was go to a French government building. He and Mary went together, and he registered her as his wife. Now, they were not married. This was a lie, but it did the trick, and it allowed Mary to eventually flee Revolutionary France, where she went back to England. But when she realized that Gilbert Imlay really had no interest in her, and in fact had found a new partner, a beautiful and young English actress in London, Mary Wollstonecraft decided to try to kill herself. And she tried to do this by overdosing on laudanum. Luckily, this did not work. Mary Wollstonecraft survived the poison. She also engaged in desperate measures to try to get Gilbert Imlay back, even when she knew he was sleeping with another woman, such as this. So Gilbert Imlay, who is this scammer of a businessman, was himself scammed. He and a business partner were trying to import goods from Scandinavia, but these goods never arrived. Essentially, somebody stole money from him. So, as an attempt to get Gilbert Imlay back, Mary Wollstonecraft decides to go after that money. So Mary Wollstonecraft and her toddler daughter, Fanny, and a young French woman that Mary Wollstonecraft had hired to be the nanny for Fanny, that's fun to say, the nanny for Fanny, the three of them embarked on an epic journey throughout Scandinavia, trying to find the men that had stolen her ex-boyfriend's money. I mean, what are the chances they're going to find that money? But this is what she did. Now, while Mary Wollstonecraft is traveling throughout Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, she did what she does best. She observed and she wrote. She learned about the customs of the people. She observed the beauty and the exoticness of Scandinavia. She, no surprise, never found the men or the money that had stolen Gilbert Imlay's money, or let me say that more correctly. And she never found Gilbert Imlay's stolen money. She never found the guys that stole from him. But she wrote about the culture and the nature and the people of this area. And so when she gets back home, well, sadly, when she got back home to London, the first thing she tried to do was commit suicide again. She threw herself in the River Thames. She tried to drown herself, but these rivermen who were there working saw her jump into the river and actually were able to rescue her, to fish her out and perform kind of an early version of CPR on her, and they resuscitated her. But having survived again, she reworked what she had written during her travels and she published it in the form of a book. This book has a kind of an awkward title. It's called Letters Written in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. But this particular book is, in my own personal opinion, the most beautiful thing that Mary Wollstonecraft ever wrote. It's a very eloquent. It is very much a work of both travel literature and romanticism. I mean, it celebrates the beauty of nature, these small little communities. It's still very much Mary Wollstonecraft, and she talks about how people who aren't free and who are not properly educated are more immoral people. This book today is a great piece of work for historians interested in the culture of Scandinavia in the 18th century. Because Mary Wollstonecraft, went to all these little small towns, and she was one of the few people to travel from town to town to town and to write in detail about what was going on in those towns at this point in time in history. And this book is written in the same popular literary style of the time. It's written as a form of letters. So if you ever look at this book, there's sort of the first letter and the second letter, and it's like you're receiving these letters from Mary Wollstonecraft, like you're in England or wherever, and she's writing you about what she's seeing in these particular times, in these particular places, and what life is like there. But this was a beautiful work of literature. It gets published. It's very popular. This is good because even though she's emotionally depressed, it's nice to at least have money in your back pocket, right? And it was so popular and so well written that at least one of the readers actually fell in love with her. William Godwin was an individual very similar to Thomas Paine. He was a political radical. He advocated for anarchism. He had written a novel called The Adventures of Caleb Williams, which presented in a novel literary form his political ideas about the benefits of anarchism and how all governments tend to be corrupt. He, William Godwin, was a radical. And he had met Mary Wollstonecraft earlier when she was living at Newington Green. And when he had met her at that stage, which would have been the late 1780s, early 1790s, he thought she was really annoying. He said that she would come into a room and try to dominate conversations. But then he read Letters from Scandinavia, and his response to reading this book was, the woman who wrote this book clearly intended for her audience to fall in love with her. For him, this book was so beautifully and eloquently written that he fell in love with its author, a woman that he knew and previously found annoying. So William Godwin approached Mary Wollstonecraft. The two of them met, the two of them talked, they began spending a lot of time together. He was already in love with her, she fell in love with him, and then, amazingly, the two of them get married. Okay, so some more recent feminists of the 20th and 21st century look back upon Mary Wollstonecraft and be like, all right, how much of a feminist was she? She's trying to encourage women to be free, but when her boyfriend, breaks up with her, she tries to commit suicide multiple times because of how brokenhearted she was. And then she talks about how marriage is this corrupt institution, but then she ends up getting married. So was Mary Wollstonecraft a real feminist, or was she a hypocrite? Well, that's one way to look at Mary Wollstonecraft. Another way to look at her is that she never abandoned her desire to live free and be an independent woman. But she also had those fundamental needs that every human being has, which is to be loved and to feel safe and secure in a loving, supportive relationship. She had tried to live this sort of independent and free life with Gilbert Imlay, and that didn't work out. And so later on, when William Godwin shows up, and he is just reverent to Mary Wollstonecraft, and here's this guy who says, I love you, I need you, I want to marry you, because of this book that you wrote, she, I think, was really taken in by that, and she trusted William Godwin. So the two of them got married. Now here's what's kind of interesting. They still did not live together. They maintained separate residences. And what's great for historians is that at this point in time in history, before telephones or text messages or anything like that, they would write each other's notes that would be delivered to their houses. So we have all this really daily correspondence between Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin that's not just love letters or philosophical stuff, but it's like, hey, I'm out of milk, can you pick some up for me? Stuff like that. These really everyday things that kind of reveal the truth of their relationship and what an incredible partnership they had. So it still was a very independent and free relationship, but they were also bound by a pledge. They were bound by a vow of commitment. As free and independent and radical as these two individuals were, Mary Wollstonecraft with her feminism, William Godwin with his anarchism, they still knew emotionally as human beings, they needed each other and they needed the other to forsake all others so that they could have a loving, committed relationship. William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft loved each other. And Mary Wollstonecraft, for the second time in her life, gets pregnant. The year was 1797. This particular portrait that I've been showing you throughout this lecture was a portrait painted by a man named John Opie, who was famous at the time for painting the portraits of famous people in England at the time, and so he painted Mary Wollstonecraft. And this portrait that you see here was painted of her while she was pregnant with her second child. And it was rumored that even though Mary Wollstonecraft was married to William Godwin, that John Opie took a liking to Mary Wollstonecraft. He might have been enamored by her spirit and her intelligence. And I've always wondered if that sharp look that Mary Wollstonecraft has in her face here was painted by a man who really admired her and was maybe infatuated with her, but couldn't have her. In the year 1797, Mary Wollstonecraft gave birth to her second child. It was another girl. The baby girl that she delivered seemed to be rather sick and frail, and people did not think that she would survive. And after the baby girl had been delivered, the afterbirth, the placenta, was not discharged from Mary Wollstonecraft's body. This was dangerous. So a doctor was called, and this doctor did what we would now know as the worst thing possible. He took his dirty, unwashed hands, because this is a day and age before any germ theory. He takes his dirty and unwashed hands, sticks them into Mary Wollstonecraft's vagina, and rips out the placenta. First of all, this had to have been extraordinarily painful for Mary Wollstonecraft. She passed out. And then, because his hands were not clean, he infected her with a disease, puerperal fever, or what we call today the blood disease, sepsis. Mary Wollstonecraft was in and out of consciousness for approximately 10 days. During that time, people thought that the daughter wasn't going to live. William Godwin came and sat next to Mary Wollstonecraft. She had only a few minutes of consciousness in which the two of them could interact, in which William Godwin could tell her that she had a baby girl that he was naming after her. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. If the doctors just simply had have let Mary Wollstonecraft be alone, if they just had have left her alone, chances are the placenta would have eventually come out by itself. But that's not what happened, and Mary Wollstonecraft would die without ever having known her second daughter, her namesake. Since Mary Wollstonecraft died in the year 1797, her legacy has gone through various phases. Her story has been reinterpreted multiple times. It didn't help that pretty soon after she died, William Godwin wrote her biography. And in his biography, he focused more on the libertine quality of Mary Wollstonecraft's life, which made her seem maybe a lot more sexually liberated than she actually was in real life. When the first wave of feminism came along in the late 19th, early 20th century, fighting for women's right to vote, there wasn't that much of a connection with Mary Wollstonecraft, since Wollstonecraft was not herself a political activist. And then when the second wave of feminism came along in the 1960s, 1970s, and it was the second wave of feminism that really, I think in spirit, had a lot with Mary Wollstonecraft's feminism. They didn't really see much inspiration in Mary Wollstonecraft because she had tried to kill herself multiple times because of a man, because of heartache. And then she seemingly sold out on her principles when she got married to William Godwin. It's really not been until the 21st century that we've had really good biographies written on Mary Wollstonecraft with a good, honest interpretation of her life. But her legacy continues to be debated, as well as how her life should be represented. If you're looking at your screen right now, you're looking at the image of a memorial that was unveiled in November of 2020 for Mary Wollstonecraft. This memorial is in Newington Green, which was, of course, the village back in Mary Wollstonecraft's day. Today it is a suburb of London, and where Mary Wollstonecraft hung out with all those other radicals like William Blake, Thomas Paine, and her publisher Joseph Johnson. But this memorial, which is inspired by the legacy of Mary Wollstonecraft, features at the pinnacle of it the body of a young, naked woman. This was controversial, and I understand why it's controversial. Mary Wollstonecraft very much advocated that for you to be free as a woman, you needed to not think of yourself as exclusively a sexual object, but to develop your mind, to be well educated, and that education will help you break free of the superficial standards that society imposes upon you. So what a very strange memorial to be unveiled in late 2020. Now, when I think of Mary Wollstonecraft's legacy to feminism, I think this quote is the best. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote, "I do not wish women to have power over men, but over themselves." And as I interpret her works, this power comes from education, constantly wanting to learn more. And this empowerment of knowledge can help you to expand your consciousness so that you can have a better understanding of reality, of life, and you can discover that there's so much to inspire you beyond the narrow expectations that a culture places upon its girls and women. It pretty much sounds like I'm quoting Francis Bacon here. Knowledge is power. And for Mary Wollstonecraft specifically, knowledge is power over yourself, to be able to live the life you want to live and to be happy. And now we move beyond the story of Mary Wollstonecraft to her daughter, her second daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. So what happened to this Mary? And what happened to Mary's older half-sister Fanny? Well, their dad, William Godwin, did his best to take care of them, but part of taking care of them was finding a new mother for them. So he found another woman, a woman who pretty much married William Godwin because he was a safe bet. William Godwin had a home, he had money, and the woman that he married, she was a widow, she had her own children, she marries him for safety and security. She certainly was no Mary Wollstonecraft. And when the two of them get married and their families combined, this new woman who would play stepmom to Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin and to Fanny Wollstonecraft, Fanny Emily, I guess is her name, she was not a nice stepmom. She did not care for those girls. And it was really beyond William's ability to protect Mary and Fanny. Now for the young Mary, her mom had died the most famous female writer in Europe. And of course she died from complications related to childbirth for her. So she never knew her mom, who died giving her life. So the young Mary, of course, becomes very interested in who her mom was, but her mom was a writer. So this young Mary Godwin spends her girlhood reading the books of her mom and dedicating herself to being the free, liberated woman that Mary Wollstonecraft wanted all females to be. She drew from her mom this inspiration. Now, because the stepmom wasn't very nice, both Mary and Fanny felt inclined to, as soon as they were able to leave home. And these two girls were very popular girls because they were the daughters of Mary Wollstonecraft. And Mary Jr. here was particularly popular because she was the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft and the anarchist William Godwin. So because of their pedigree, because of who their parents were, they were seen as very, well, how do I say this? A lot of people just wanted to know what the kids were like, what these girls were like. And they became particularly popular with young radical men, like the Romantic poets. And one of the young Romantic poets that took an interest in the young Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin was Percy Shelley. Percy Shelley was a married man. Young Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin was 16 years old. But Percy Shelley convinced Mary that he loved her. She felt strongly about him too. So Percy Shelley left his wife to marry the young Mary. Percy Shelley's wife ended up committing suicide, and Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin becomes Mary Shelley. While the two were courting each other, they would spend time on the grave of Mary Wollstonecraft, reading Mary Wollstonecraft's works, the young couple dedicating themselves to living a free and liberated life. Percy was friends with many of the romantic poets of the age, including this individual, Lord Byron, the bad boy of the early 19th century. And Byron and Shelley and Mary Shelley and several others of the young wild romantics, they were having some difficulty living in England, so they all ran away together to here, where Byron purchased a small castle on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And it was here where Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron and a handful of others were spending time together, mostly partying. There was probably no shortage of laudanum when one of the great moments in literary history happened. Before I get to this story, this has a very modern celebrity feel to it, this particular castle. First of all, the people that lived nearby, they set up telescopes on their property so that they could watch the partying going on in this particular castle where Lord Byron and his entourage were. And some of the neighbors actually made money charging people who wanted to come and stare through the telescope and watch the young romantics have a grand old time in their castle. If you visit this place today, in the basement of it, Lord Byron chiseled his name, a memorial of the Romantic era of the early 19th century. All right, and then this great moment in literary history. The year was 1816. Mary Shelley was 19 years old. They were all hanging out at Lake Geneva, partying, and a horrible storm comes up. And it was one of these iconic, cliche, dark and stormy nights. But these are young people, they're poets, they're dropping laudanum, and this seems to be the perfect mood for Byron to suggest to all of them, hey, why don't we each retire to our separate quarters and write a horror story? Let's see who can write the best horror story. So the 19-year-old Mary Shelley goes to her room in Byron's castle and begins writing the first draft of one of the most important pieces of literature, and certainly the most famous thing she would ever write, Frankenstein. So let's learn about Frankenstein. So the plot of Frankenstein is essentially this. Frankenstein is a doctor who learns how to reanimate dead tissue. So he assembles body parts of corpses to create the creature, and harnessing the power of electricity animates the dead tissue to come to life, to bring to life the creature. Okay, so when you hear the word Frankenstein, a lot of people think of the Frankenstein, the monster. Just be aware, if you have not read this book, that Frankenstein is in fact the doctor. He's the creator. And he's from Switzerland, which seems appropriate because that's where Mary Shelley was when she was writing the book. And he is a respectable doctor. And he seems to have a very bright future in front of him. He's engaged to be married to a beautiful young woman. And as this aspiring innovator, this great doctor, he wants to do something that nobody else has done before. So he invents this living creature. And so he creates, well, just that, the creature. So, by the way, if I can just pause, and since I'm looking at the screen right now, the image of Frankenstein that we have, that you see there on the left, that's the American, I think it's American, the actor Boris Karloff from the earliest film adaptations of Frankenstein. And in all the film adaptations that I know of, Frankenstein is this brutal monster. It's this killer that comes to life. But the book is very, very different. So in the book, Frankenstein's creature is this very tall, extraordinarily strong, and powerful thing that when he comes to life, Frankenstein, the creator, Frankenstein, the doctor, he looks at his creation, and this is a part of the book that I just find bizarre in terms of how Mary Shelley wrote it. The doctor just sort of runs away. He just flees. It's like he's just immediately scared of what he's created, and he just runs away from it. And then we, the reader, are left with the creature. And this creature is not an evil thing. The creature is a sad thing that just wants the love of his creator. He wants a family. He wants to be cared for. And this is the big difference between all the film adaptations of Frankenstein, the horror films of Frankenstein, and the book Frankenstein. In the book, this creature just wants to be loved. So it's born into this world and it's lonely. So the creature ventures out into the world. And as part of the, I guess we could call it the adventures of the creature, he finds himself looking at a home. So he comes across this sort of home out in the woods somewhere. And in this home is a happy family. So the creature sort of perches itself up in a tree where it can go unnoticed, but he can still look down into the window to see this home. And he sees a family. He sees a mom and a dad, and I think a baby girl. And they eat dinners together and they talk to one another. There are books in the home. And when the family's not there, the creature goes into the home and borrows these books and learns how to read and reads these books to educate itself. And from these books, he learns about humanity. But at this time, he's just aching to be part of a family. And he finally goes down and reveals himself to this family, but the family screams in horror. And that just makes him feel even more lonely, even more misunderstood. So when you read this book, you empathize with the monster. And of course, you naturally feel that there is part of you that is like this monster, because don't we all feel lonely and misunderstood? And don't we all want to be loved? And that's sort of the painful aching of Frankenstein. And so then finally, when Frankenstein goes and finds his creator, Dr. Frankenstein, I'm sorry, I should use my words correctly here. When the creature, Frankenstein's creation, the creature finally decides, I want to go and find Dad, and goes and finds Dr. Frankenstein. Dr. Frankenstein wants nothing to do with the creator. The doctor tells the creation in the most brutal way possible how awful it is, how revolting of a creation he is. And the poor creature's like, please just take me in. And the doctor says no. And at this point in the story, the something inside the creature just breaks. That if nobody will love me, then I will destroy people. But here's how he gets his vengeance. He doesn't go after Dr. Frankenstein and kill Dr. Frankenstein. He wants to do something far worse to the doctor. Instead of killing him, he goes after the fiancée and he kills her so that Dr. Frankenstein can feel the pain of loss. So that is sort of the central plot of the novel Frankenstein. I didn't give it all away, but I did give away the big parts of it. And there's a variety of ways in which people can interpret Frankenstein. There's a reason why it's one of the greatest novels of all time. There are multiple layers to it. But let's look at it from the historical perspective and what we know about Mary Shelley. Many people feel that the creature is Mary Shelley. There's a sense of abandonment, there's a sense of loss, there's a sense of being misunderstood, and there is a sense of being unloved. This is a creature that grew up abandoned by its dad, and the creature also never had a mother. Now, it's not true to say that William Godwin in any way abandoned Mary. In fact, he did anything but abandon Mary, but William Godwin did marry this woman who ended up being a very cruel stepmom to Mary Shelley, and Mary Shelley felt driven away at a fairly young age because of the stepmom. So there may be several autobiographical elements in this novel, which there are probably a lot of autobiographical elements in a lot of novels. But Mary Shelley was probably just capturing a mood that I think we all feel from time to time, the sense that nobody understands us, we feel rejected, we feel like we're a monster in the eyes of others, and we just really want to be loved and cared for. And if not, we can become vicious and cruel. Okay. Now, the other thing that we can do as students of history is to look at Frankenstein as a great work of romantic literature. And part of romantic literature is, as you hopefully know, a rejection of science and technology that was really a product of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. So we can look at Dr. Frankenstein as the embodiment of cold, rational, scientific, and technological development. Somebody who's inspired to develop technology, to harness the power of nature, and to control nature, to even have the power to make the dead live again, and to create these new and incredible things. So in that way, we can look at the creature as the new society, the new technological society. But this new technological society, as wondrous as it is in terms of a technological development, if there is no love, if there is no nurturing, if there is no maternal care, this new technologically advanced society will kill us or kill the things we love. So that's another way that we can look at Frankenstein and really put it in with the Romantic movement of the early 19th century. There is a great quote near the end of the book. Dr. Frankenstein was running away from the creature, and the creature caught up to him and was having this confrontation with his creator. And Dr. Frankenstein is just scared to death, thinking that his creation is now going to kill him. And the creature looks at Dr. Frankenstein and he says, "You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey." All right, you are my creator, but I am your master. Obey. What a great phrase that we can use with any technological innovation that comes along in history. We human beings can create the most incredible things. Everything from refrigerators to airplanes to cell phones. We create these things, but once they are introduced into our lives, then all of a sudden, we can't live without them. I mean, within the last, couple decades of my life, I've watched the cell phone take over people's lives. And, back when I was in high school and well beyond high school, nobody needed a cell phone. Now, people can't go a day without their cell phone because we're so dependent upon this new technology. And I mean, all we have to do is go back in time 150 years. There was no electricity. There were no HVAC systems, air conditioning, there was no refrigeration, there were no cars, there were no airplanes, there was no telephone, there was no TV, there wasn't even radio 150 years ago. And human beings survived. And then we developed this technology, and now it's like, well, now we can't get along without it. We're completely dependent upon new things that come along. So you can take this phrase from Frankenstein and apply it to any new form of technology that comes along. And it's kind of interesting to think about. I don't know what the future holds in terms of technology, but here's what I can tell you about it. It's going to come along. We're going to think it's neat or silly. Like, why do we need that? We don't need that. But it'll at least be a curiosity, and then it'll be adapted into American life. And then it'll be like, well, how did I get along without it? And your kids, whatever new technology will come along, and they'll ask you, "Mom, Dad, how did you live before without this thing?" And you'll say, "Oh boy, we really had to rough it back then before this new technology came along." And I don't know what this new technology, the future is going to be, but I'll tell you that's exactly what's going to happen. We are the creators, but those things are going to be our masters. What a great line from Frankenstein that you can apply to any new form of technology that comes along. You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey. As opposed to her mom, Mary Shelley lived a nice long life, although her husband Percy didn't. He died in a boating accident. He ended up drowning. Some historians speculate that it might have been suicide, but who knows? He drowned. Mary Shelley wrote a wide variety of things, including a great work of science fiction called The Last Man, in which humanity destroys itself, but there was only one individual left walking the earth. And this novel takes place when Mary Shelley thought humanity was coming to an end. It takes place at the end of the 21st century. That's The Last Man by Mary Shelley. There were a lot of people who died in Mary Shelley's life. Her husband, Fanny, her older half-sister, she died when she committed suicide with laudanum, which is, of course, how her mom, Mary Wollstonecraft, first tried to commit suicide. She had fallen in love with Percy and run away with him, and Percy's wife committed suicide. There was death all around her, and she probably felt haunted. And some people think that that also motivated this idea of Frankenstein bringing the dead back to life. But of all the people who had passed away, the one that had inspired her the most was her mom. And here is a very touching quote that reflects that. So to wrap up this particular lecture, I did mention that Mary Wollstonecraft has had a bit of a turbulent legacy. And it really began with her husband, William Godwin, writing a biography that was not really accurate about her personal life. And then later waves of feminism, not really being able to find in Mary Wollstonecraft the inspiration they were looking for their own historical time periods. But in the 21st century, there have been some amazing historians who've come along and really done a lot of research on Mary Wollstonecraft. A lot of that research I've hopefully faithfully presented here to provide a more accurate overview of this woman's life and the impact that she had on history. So I became fascinated with Mary Wollstonecraft in the late 1990s when I was in graduate school at Ohio State University. And I had to do a research paper on a figure from the Enlightenment. And the professor didn't mention anything about Mary Wollstonecraft, and all I knew about Mary Wollstonecraft at the time was what I had read about her in a textbook. And I was kind of curious why the professor didn't talk about her at all. I think he just was more interested in the Enlightenment in France and in the German states. He just didn't care much about what was going on in England, or he certainly didn't talk about it at all in class. So I thought, well, I'm gonna research Mary Wollstonecraft, and so I wrote a paper about her, and I read The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, or at least part of it. I don't think I read it cover to cover. I wrote the paper, and then that was it. And then it was 10 years later when I was already a history teacher. It was the year 2009. And I really started to get interested in who Mary Wollstonecraft actually was. So I started reading a series of books on Mary Wollstonecraft. And the 3 books that you see up here on the screen are the 3 books that I've read. And these are the order in which I read them. In 2009, I read Lyndall Gordon's Vindication, A Life of Mary Wollstonecraft. This is a fairly short book. It's about 250 pages long, something like that. And this book reads like just a dramatic movie. If you just want a short book that captures the drama of Mary Wollstonecraft's life, this is a good book. Also, it talks a lot about Mary Wollstonecraft's impact on the people that she knew, and how she inspired them, and how Mary Wollstonecraft did a lot to inspire not just her own daughter, Mary Shelley, but many other literary figures throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. But then if there's any historian that's done a lot to present an accurate biography of Mary Wollstonecraft, it's the middle book, Janet Todd. This is a huge book. I don't know, it's like 500-600 pages long. And man, it is detailed on the life of Mary Wollstonecraft. I mean, if you want to know what Mary Wollstonecraft had for lunch and the middle of June in 1794, if there's some historical record of it, it's in Janet Todd's book, Mary Wollstonecraft, A Revolutionary Life. But this book is long, but it's beautifully written. Janet Todd is herself quite a just wordsmith. She just writes with beautiful vocabulary and really gives you a sense of how Mary Wollstonecraft lived her life. And then after I read those 2 books, I'm like, wow, okay, I really know Mary Wollstonecraft. And so when the book Romantic Outlaws came along, I think this book was published like 2014, 2015. I saw it in the bookstore, but I didn't pay it any mind because I'm like, I've already read 2 books on Mary Wollstonecraft. I don't need to read any more. But then I broke down and I got it and I read it. And this book, Romantic Outlaws, is by far the best book on Mary Wollstonecraft. And what's really cool is it's a dual biography of Mary Wollstonecraft and her daughter Mary Shelley. And so the first chapter is on Mary Wollstonecraft, the second chapter is on Mary Shelley, and then it goes back chapter 3 Wollstonecraft, chapter 4 Shelley, and it bounces between their 2 lives in parallel. So when the author Charlotte Gordon, who is an American literary historian, when she writes this book, it's like one chapter talks about what Mary Wollstonecraft was like when she was a teenager, and then it goes to what Mary Shelley was like when she was a teenager. And the way Charlotte Gordon sews these 2 stories together is just brilliant. And this book was just such a fun read. So if you're ever interested in reading more about this stuff, Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon, I give that one my biggest thumbs up. And you can learn about the really wild and crazy revolutionary lives that both of these women lived. And there's my brief little book review. And this ends this particular lecture on Mary Wollstonecraft and her daughter Mary Shelley. I certainly hope that you enjoyed the story of feminism and Frankenstein. Hey guys, that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a wonderful day. See you next time. Bye-bye.